Te Māori o rangirao ko papa kia rarau ngā tapu e o tāne ki mua. Ai o ki te wirangi, ai o ki te whenua, ai o āwaho, āroto, tūturo whiti whakamaua kia tīna. Haumi e, hui e, tai. Hono koutou rā kua hara mai nei ki tēnei kaupapa nui, nau mai piki mai hara mai. He mihi ki ngā maungi karapoti nei a tātou, he mihi anō ki te mana whenua Ngāti Toa Rangatira Te Atiawa Taranaki whānui. Honora koutou katoa, kei ngā mana, kei ngā reo, nau mai piki mai hara mai. Ki ngā rangatira tētahi nei kua hono a pukemata mai, Elaine, tēnā koe, me tēnei nei noho nei Ken, tēnā kōro nei, hei whakarangatira tēnei tuāhuatanga i te rānei. Look, I just want to acknowledge everyone here today, and yeah, look, it is a great occasion. Welcome to the Michael Volkerling Lecture Series. I do want to acknowledge Michael, Ruth, tēnā koe. Although our guest speakers will be introduced by Connell, I do want to say with both Elaine Gurian and Ken Gorbey, two great leaders who also shared the dream and vision for our National Museum to be something far more different than it was. So, kia kōrua, tēnā kōrua mai te ngākau. Welcome back to your whare, our place. Tēnā kōrua, tēnā koutou. Look, just a few things for me. I'm just going to share a few whakaaro on Dr. Michael Volkerling's career and legacy, and then a little bit, very, very briefly, about the partnership between National Services Te Paerangi and Victoria University, the Museum and Heritage Studies. But look, of the late Dr. Michael Volkerling, as a key architect of New Zealand's cultural sector, Michael held a number of roles that were pivotal to the establishment and development of the museum, art and creative sectors. Michael had a distinguished career in arts management, teaching and cultural research in New Zealand and Australia. In his role as the Executive Director of the National Museum and National Art Gallery between 1988 and 1993, he oversaw the amalgamation of the National Museum and National Art Gallery and the development of the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa Te Papa. He was ideally placed to fulfil this role, having been Chief Executive of the Queen Elizabeth II Arts Council of New Zealand before he joined Te Papa. A key moment in Michael Volkerling's directorship, and I've selected this, was the Te Māori exhibition in 1984-86, a milestone in the Māori cultural renaissance. Te Māori was a watershed moment and defining moment in our nation's history. When the exhibition opened in New York at the Met and gained momentum, the Arts Council took the opportunity to support and help the arts and cultural groups. They gave financial and administrative support and funded artists to go to America as part of the exhibition. Michael's measured nod and words of reason found a way to open hardened hearts entrenched in arts definitions. In fact, the management committee set up by Cabinet in 1981, when it was confirmed that an exhibition of Māori art would travel to America, to the United States, included representatives from the Department of Internal Affairs, Māori Affairs, the Queen Elizabeth Arts Council, the Art Galleries and Museums Associations of New Zealand, and Ken would be well aware of that, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Lending Museums, the Māori and South Pacific Arts Council, MASPAC, as well as the curators. I'm sure to this day that if it hadn't been for the success of Te Māori, we would not have been created, Te Papa Tongarewa. Now, before Michael passed away, I spoke to him at the museum's Aotearoa conference in Napier. We shared a long discussion about museums and their value to the communities, and in particular to Māori. When Dame Cheryl was appointed as Te Papa's first chief executive in 1993, Michael moved to the Victoria University, where he established, managed and taught in the Museum and Heritage Studies program. This long association with museums and academia continued for the rest of his career, and he trained many of the new generation of museum professionals. Michael, Ruth, kōruatahi, thank you for all that you have done and the legacy that you have given to us. And look, I just very, very briefly talk about the partnership with Victoria University. I want to acknowledge Professor Conal McCarthy, head of the Museum and Heritage Studies at Victoria University. 6 years ago, National Services Te Paerangi partnered with Victoria University's Museum and Heritage Studies program to create an annual lecture series that honours Michael's legacy, bringing together thought leaders to imagine the future of museums. Past lectures have considered the role museums have to play in equality and access, global warming, ecological recovery and cultural restitution. In this lecture, we're turning our attention to the impact of COVID, which has driven the museum sector to quickly change and adapt, forcing a rethink of museums and their practice. Lying at the intersection of museological philosophy and practice, we hope these lectures act as an awakening force to shift our thinking, spark new ideas, and pave the way to form a future-facing sector that is ready to meet the many challenges of the 21st century. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce, I'm not quite sure whether Connor will walk up here. Hono, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora hui mai tātai, kia ora arapata mō tō mihi whakatau te rā nei. Kia ora tātou e whakarongo mai nei te pūrangi anō hoki. Welcome everybody, thank you Arapata for that very kind introduction. And I'm sitting very casually like this because of my broken leg, so my apologies for my posture up here today. I'd like to join Arapata in acknowledging Michael Volkerling, who of course was the founding director of the Museum and Heritage Studies program at Victoria University, and it's great to be here in partnership with National Services Te Paerangi with the sixth of these lectures. And today we have two old friends and associates speaking to us, one from Puerto Rico, kia ora Elaine, and one here in Wellington. And my job today is really to chair the session, to introduce each speaker, who are going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then to facilitate a discussion between these two, and then to open things up to questions from Slido, from the web, and from our audience. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we start. First of all, if you're listening in and you'd like to take advantage of the free Te Papa Wi-Fi, please do click on the website, click on accepting conditions, and you can get the free Te Papa Wi-Fi. And for the Slido app, through which you can ask questions, Slido, hold up your phone in the camera mode to the QR code, and that will take you through to the Slido app. So just hold up your phone with the camera mode onto the QR code on the screen there, and it'll take you through to the Slido app where you can ask questions from me, and we'll field those questions a little bit later in today's lecture. The year 2020 has been quite extraordinary, and we all appreciate, I think, that the world has changed, probably for good. And museums, galleries and heritage organisations, amongst many other sectors, have been unalterably affected by not only the pandemic, but other crises that have followed in the wake of COVID-19, including widespread debate and reckoning about racism in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protest in the USA, economic and financial issues, the halting of tourism, and elections here and there. So what we want to do today is to think about the future of museums post-COVID and look forward to how we can reconceive the models, the methods, the practices of these institutions in the world that has changed so much. And we're going to start off with Elaine Heumann Gurian. Elaine is a very well-known international museum consultant who had a distinguished career at the Smithsonian in Washington, at the Holocaust Museum, the National Museum for the American Indian, and other institutions, and has been involved in museum building projects all around the world, including in the 1990s here at Te Papa before its opening in 1998, when she formed a close relationship with Ken Gorbey, seated here on my left, and these two have been fast friends and associates and thinkers, I think, over the last 2 decades. So we're going to first of all go to Elaine, who's going to give us her thoughts on museums and the current climate. She's going to speak for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to hear from Ken, and then we're going to have a discussion between them before we open things up for questions. Kia ora, Elaine, over to you.
Kia ora, everyone, and thank you so much, Connell. And thank you, Arapata. It brings back wonderful memories for me. I'm coming to you from a tiny island in the Caribbean called Vieques. It's east of mainland Puerto Rico, and it has 9,000 people. It is the island that was hit by Maria, and it is the island about which, in addition to mainland Puerto Rico, the now former president of the United States threw paper towels at as if it would help us. I knew and loved Michael Volkerling. He was a man of very careful thought, kindness, and he was an expert cook. And because I came to New Zealand about 4 times a year, sometimes up to a month at a time, Ruth and Michael were kind enough to invite me each time to a lovely and thoughtful dinner. Ken and I compared notes, and we would like to jointly say it was always a pleasure to be in Michael and Ruth's company, and we thank them for their constant welcome. It's an extreme pleasure, even if virtually, to be on the stage with my friend and wholly trusted ally, Ken Gorbey. Book, work, passion, loyalty, constancy, and kindness all have his name properly attached to them. It is beyond a pleasure to be back into New Zealand. Let me thank Connell, who has been kind enough to let me help teach his classes once in a while. And let me remark about my friends, my love of pavlova and hot lemon and honey, my walk to Te Papa, and my jealousy of Jacinda Ardern. It's an honor to be back. I've been envious of your country and of your leader, but now, thank heavens, we have Joe Biden, who was a thoroughly decent man as president, and Kamala Harris representing a broken glass ceiling at last. Their election is a deep relief to 51% of its citizens. 51%. And what about the other 49%? America is a deeply divided and very uneven and quite dangerous place, and we will have to live through this and see what we can. Museums are certainly never going to be the same, and the way museums find themselves now, with countries as divided and unhappy as my own, will be a very interesting and difficult new trip. I have 4 PowerPoint slides. They are entitled The Power of Evidence, and evidence is the word I use for the indelibility of memory, real or imagined. First, I'd like to read you some synonyms of evidence, because it's not the materiality of things that I speak about, but their corroboration and other words like proof, confirmation, verification, substantiation, affirmation, authentication. All these words are really the kind of leitmotif of the way I would like you to rethink museums. And what I'm going to talk about is 4 different ways to look at what museums of the future might work more about. Next slide, please. The first one is the building as evidence. And by the building as evidence, I am not talking about its architecture, though its architecture is always wonderful and powerful. I'm talking about a building that speaks for itself. Its assets are part of the civic firmament. It belongs to people. It's part of the community, and it projects its meaning, even though it doesn't speak. Let me tell you what you're looking at. You're looking at Fenway Park, one of the oldest baseball fields in the United States. And you're looking at people lined up to vote in pre-voting because buildings all over the United States understood that if they made themselves available for voting in ways that had never been true before, more people would come out in this consequential election. Fenway Park has never been a voting place. It stayed open 36 consecutive hours to allow people to enter it in order to vote. Next slide, please. What you're looking at, it says space is evidence, and what you're looking at is not stuffed animals eating, but you're looking at a zoo's cafeteria in which stuffed animals have been set there as social distancing during COVID. And imagine the children's delight to come in, eat their lunch, sitting next to a capybara that's stuffed. The spaces evidence is about not the exhibition space, but the spaces of assembly where strangers can safely meet. And if you've read Jane Jacobs, you will understand that the more activity in spaces marked like city streets, the safer and more peaceable a city can be, both inside and out. Ken, in his wisdom, put together the cafe into Papa in the middle of the second floor and changed the way the building was used forever, because eating is the great familiarization, and all of a sudden parents could have a cup of coffee while their children could explore. Next slide, please. We usually don't think of people as evidence. This is a picture out the window of the White House of Joe Biden sitting on a sunny day with some woman who I don't know who it is. At the bottom it says a vice president who listens to women, and on top is the most important piece about people. This photograph was taken by a man named Pete Souza. Pete Souza was invited by Barack Obama on the first day of his presidency to accompany him for the next 8 years through every waking hour. He was the documenter of Barack Obama. It is to him you owe all those wonderful pictures of Barack Obama and babies. When Donald Trump was elected, Pete Souza was so outraged that he every day on Twitter put up a corresponding picture of Barack Obama that reminded us how presidencies are supposed to be run and what civility is really like. And it would say something like a vice president who listens to women. Pete Souza changed from being a photographer to being a spokesman by becoming the curator of the evidence he had taken. Cliff Whiting was such a person as well. We have national treasures in Japan, and it behooves us to start to think of people as evidence in addition to things. Last slide, please. This is the Mirai walking distance from where you are sitting. Designed by and overseen by Cliff Whiting, but carved by young carvers, which included women, and became one of the great Mirais and great art pieces ever. However, what's really astounding about this Mirai is that the protocol changes when iwis become in charge of it, and it is a fully functioning Mirai, a place of activity within a museum. It is not static. It is faith-based and not rational. It is not ours, and it is not owned by any one iwi. It is owned by the nation. These are 4 different ways you can rethink museums in this age. past COVID, one hopes, in your country certainly past COVID. The building as evidence, the space as evidence, the people as evidence, and the collection as evidence. And I would suggest that museums in those contexts are more important than we think, and less for the reasons we think they're important, and more for these reasons. Thank you.
Kia ora, Elaine. Thoughts from Puerto Rico. Ken Gorbey is now going to give us a few thoughts. Ken is well known to all of you here, of course, a pioneer museologist in this country who worked at the Waikato Museum, Te Papa and the Jewish Museum Berlin, as well as being involved in many other museum projects around New Zealand and around the world. And Ken has just published his memoirs with Te Papa Press, which is a great read. And there you can see this thinking through the decades about what museums are for, what value they have, what role they play in society. So Ken is now going to give us a few thoughts, and then we're going to have a conversation.
Kia ora tātou. I prefer to stand. And Connell, thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here with Elaine. It wasn't 2 decades, it's 5.5 decades. Elaine and I met at the Boston Children's Museum in 1975, and we haven't stopped talking since. About museums defined not so much by their history as the best ways in which these institutions can strengthen their communities. Today, COVID-19 is on our minds. But it is best to broaden our thinking back to those crises that have stressed museums, and of course many to close, and out another 50 years or so to those we will face in the next 50 years. Unless there is some technological and economic revolution waiting out there that we know nothing about yet, these stresses will threaten the resources pools that museums draw on. How can we best survive and continue to serve? Now, consider a few stresses. The big one, of course, seems to be climate change. This slide is very old. I keep on using it. Every time I use it, I update, and it's still extant. It is the summary of a whole lot of projections done by scientists that we trust. We don't know this science, but we trust these people. And unfortunately, what this slide tells us is that we are still on that red line. We are heading towards climatic change that will involve temperatures of something between +3 and 5 degrees centigrade. As a result of this, a lot of money, a lot of that resource that we like to think of as partly ours, is going to go into mitigation. Population growth. Now, there was a time when I would say, let's look at line 2 there. But recently, it's got a little bit better. The projections are that in 2064, we will be peaking at around about the 10 billion people. And most of that growth, by the way, will be in Africa. But that's a lot of people for this planet of ours floating out here in space to adequately sustain. And that's going to be a huge pressure on world resource. Put those two together, and let's look at the stresses that act on a nation, in this particular case, a particularly susceptible nation, Bangladesh. Population growth. 160 million at the time, growing towards 200 million. Climate change. Look at the surges, storm surges out of the Bay of Bengal, bottom left, that are flooding so much of the territory that is Bangladesh. Look at the floods, red, coming down from mountains that no longer have those reservoirs of snow and ice upon them. And this nation is sorely threatened by these actions. Internationals, locals, mobiles. Internationals, 200 million people who are used to traveling around the world, but not so much these days, not in COVID-19 territory. Those are the people who can work anywhere. The locals, the great majority of people in this world are locals. They are born and they live within a nation, perhaps some of them within a very small territory and do not move out of it. But increasingly, there is this group called the mobiles, the people who are deciding that they will make a huge change for themselves and their families by shifting to greater economic promise. Some of them as refugees, some of them as migrants, many of them as those illegals who are taking boats across the oceans, dangerously across the oceans at the present moment. Some scenarios are suggesting that as a result of this, we, a nation like New Zealand surrounded by water, might be spending a lot more on defence into the future. We have critics that we must listen to. I'll try again. No. On collections, this amazing Australian artist who I dearly love, Joan Ross. Listen to Joan. I am critical of the collecting mentality as an ongoing disease fueled by superiority and greed. Now, she's talking about Australian museums here. And she even includes in her painting, Oh History, You Lied to Me, the butterfly murderer on the left there. Now, she's not the only one. In my book, I'm quoting a New Zealand academic who worries at objects that should be full of cultural life going into museums to die. Keep that in mind. James Horden, dead now, unfortunately, on the honest renditions of history. The seeming inability of some museums to confront contentious histories. And he was an expert in slavery and free slavery movements. These histories that reach into our hearts, they are personal and even damaging to us. Panjay Mishra on Indian nationalism and Brexit and Hungary and Poland and Trumpism, who was asking the question of us, not just museums, but cultural institutions as a whole, are we not just the vanity projects of an intellectual elite? And how can we not be that? How can we museums not be just vanity projects that are good for people of economic privilege like us who are gathered here today? And then last but not least, Sirota and Jones, two of our museological heavies, calling us to task. Are we not just a great big bunch of heavy buildings with 24-hour, 365 days a week air conditioning plants pumping away? Are we part of the problem, says the ex-directors of the Tate and the V&A. And of course, the whole idea of Black Lives Matter. Now, there's something very wrong with this slide. Some of the students have already seen this and probably answered this question. Black Lives Matter is of today, isn't it? People marching the streets, but no, this is Watts, 1965. Equity is a problem that the world faces at the present moment and has faced for a long time, and we have not solved it. Now, it's going to require the redistribution of resources. And how is that going to influence us? How are we going to support that redistribution of resources? Where do we, consumers of tax-based resources, stand on initiatives to redistribute those resources and achieve equity? The personal philosophy bit. In face of a world that is going through dramatic and stressful changes, how can we best resist the crushing authority of antiquated museum models and build anew? Now, I suggest a lighter mode, ubiquitous, distributed, and integrated into daily life. The words, of course, of Elizabeth Merritt. Now, we need to maintain the larger national museums. They are incredibly important. They carry national issues. We must have that. But not have every other museum slavishly follow the large museum model. Instead, I believe we need to be inventive in creating community-based institutions and clusters thereof that accept and treat the views of a greatly broadened audience. And my example has always been, will always be, the Watchtowers complex. Here you have the Watchtowers built by the Italian migrant. To the left is the Watchtowers Art Centre behind the white van, where art meets truth. To the right, where the people are clustered in that slide on the left there, the local people's interpretation of their history. And they talk of a Latino and Afro-American history. And they do not talk of the Watts riots, they talk of the Watts rebellion. We rebelled, we rose up against violent police and corrupt officials. Now this to me is a wonderful model for the future of a broad thing, which I'm going to call museum, but which is clusters of cultural activity. In Geelong, see the history of Geelong, experience it, walk it, carry the book with Jan Mitchell's wonderful bollards. It's a museum, but it is not contained within the building. And down below here, there's Michael Keith and a New Zealand initiative. For this, we need a new definition, a much broader definition based on community activity, not place, not plant. And I suggest that the museum of the next 50 years, or at least many of the museums of the next 50 years, will be moral-based cultural activity, not place, activity, given purpose and form by its owner community. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Ken. What we're going to do now is talk to these two a little bit, and they will no doubt start also talking to one another about some of the issues that they've picked up. So Elaine has talked about the notion of evidence, she's talked about buildings, space and people, and she left us with a really tantalising question about the museum's role. So Elaine, I want to pick up on a couple of things you said and ask you to elaborate a little bit more. When you said the museum's role is not what you think, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Ken and I agree, though I would unpack a second about what he's talking about. There are multiple museums, but in the end, one of the things that I'm talking about is that they belong to a panoply of civic structures that we have created, we humans have created, at base because we wished our memories, however we constructed them, to be immortalized and be reusable in some form, either for others or our children. And when I start to talk about buildings, I talk about it belonging to the community for its own use. And the image that I usually use is we have toilets and heating, and as Ken points out, air conditioning. And we have people on the streets who need those things, and we don't make them available to them. But if you think of the building as part of the fabric that society has decided to use to house memories, because we equate memories with soul, with our sense of ourselves and value, then how it gets realized is a complicated issue. So what Ken is talking about works very well within my sense of how a community is going to recollect itself, real or imagined. Let me lay one more thing down, and that is post-Trump, one of the things we are going to have to do in America is to figure out a way to reconcile what is not only disparate memories, but memories that people are willing to shoot each other over. That the issue of Civil War statuary has nothing to do with Civil War statues. And in fact, they were not made at the Civil War, nor were they made immediately post-Civil War. They were constructed as nostalgic views of a memory that didn't happen. So the community fight over its story is really going to be the business of museums, and the tools that they use can be everything. And Ken is quite right, it doesn't need to turn out to be a building controlled by very rich people.
Really interesting, Elaine, that you talk about evidence in these terms: post-Trump, post-truth, post-COVID. I was really struck too, actually, when Ken showed the slide of the Watts riots. I've heard you talk about the beginning of your museum career in the activism of the late 1960s after the death of Martin Luther King. For you, the current moment after Black Lives Matter and the situation in the US and the role of museum activism, where do you see the parallels and differences from the 60s to the present?
We failed, and we show every indication of failing again. The mouthing of inclusion is one of, because it's not realized all the time, is one of the moments that make me cringe. If you look at museums and their participation even now in Black Lives Matter, what they really are trying to do is replicate themselves with people of color, but without changing the model of what they're doing or what how the people should be trained or what experience they might have had. So the model for me and the model I use is Te Papa, and the original Te Papa, where Maturanga Mari was written as a way of trying to figure out equivalencies in the payroll. I think the whole game is going to be played in the HR department. I think the breakdown of what it means to be a truth teller of your community and whether it has anything to do with academia is going to be one of the fulcrums on which we go forward.
Thanks, Elaine. And just to touch on academia for a moment, in 2006 you wrote a book called Civilizing the Museum, which brought together a lot of your writings and thoughts about museums. And for those of you listening, Elaine's website, elainegurian.com, is a fantastic resource of a lot of her writing and thinking. You are now working on a new book, bringing together your more recent thinking, and you've called it Recentering the Museum. Can you talk just a little bit about your thinking from civilizing the museum 15 years ago to recentering the museum, and what lies behind that centering?
It's not called recentering, because the museums have never been centered. It's called centering.
Okay.
And it's an attempt to try and figure out if we understand the word inclusion to mean people we hate as well as people we love. And if we can figure out a moral center where we can get along with the center left and the center right and still oust the kind of Nazism and violence that we cannot tolerate. And that's a moral journey that museums have not yet begun on.
Thanks, Elaine. I can see Ken nodding at that. And that was one of the points where your two presentations intersected. Ken talked about unity, the need to redistribute resources, but also to speak to those people that are not in that kind of elite cultural sort of group. Ken, do you want to expand on that a little bit in terms of reaching across the aisle, dialogue, a space to bring people together?
Well, I wonder if museums can in fact be the true forum. Te Papa has gone a long way down that track, and I'm so pleased that it still has an international reputation for that. But perhaps the profession as a whole has not quite got there yet. I collect museums, and it would be a very uncomfortable gathering, some of the museums that I have in the back of my mind. The director of the Museum of Noah's Ark is going to talk to us today. And he's going to tell us all about the fact that science is well and good as long as it accords to the Bible. Now, I still think that discussion has to be had. And that's where the forum, called the wider museum, as a set of activities, as a bunch of cultural innovators and activists, is important. But it needs to reach out to what Panjai Mishra calls the ressentiment, the people who do feel as though they are not part of this vanity-strewn liberal movement. And I think we have to try and bring those people in. That's why I love the likes of Jan Mitchell's sculptures on the foreshore of Geelong. It doesn't exclude anyone. You just wander around it and you have a load of fun while you're having your swim and all the rest of it. That, to me, would be the ideal future of the museum profession. And by the way, there are a whole heap of career opportunities waiting for you within that new concept of museum.
Elaine, your thoughts about that? Because you've sort of touched on that as well in the sort of the US context with Trumpism and Trumpists and trying to sort of bring people together. The museum has a role to play in that kind of civic dialogue.
Is that me or Ken? I would like to hear Ken talk about the civic dialogue with the Trumpists, because I don't know where to go. I spent today talking to the Jewish Museum Association, because for Jews, what we have lived through the last 4 years was a playbook we understood. And until we have the new president really in place, the terror of the Jewish museum community is that not only have they seen this before, but they don't know how to engage in a dialogue except one of misery with the Trumpists themselves. So if Ken has any ideas, the whole world is listening.
Our model shouldn't be Trump. I would look more towards the strong female leaders that we have in the world today. Not just New Zealand, we're very fortunate. But Angela Merkel and her nation, they are the people that I think we need to be talking about much more. Because look at Angela Merkel. She opened the door. People thought it was political suicide. She opened the door to a million Syrian refugees. Now, at the time, it was disaster, but it proved not to be. The Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, rose and got political clout because of her decision, but then are fading away because of the success of what she managed to achieve, taking in refugees. And by the way, New Zealand claims a lot of moral high ground, but we've got no moral high ground whatsoever when it comes to the number of refugees we bring into this country.
Now, I'd just like to move on now to some of the points that Ken made and in terms of museum models, which we're grappling with today. So Ken talked about the global pandemic, climate, population pressures, and moving away from traditional models of museums that have to do with capital, plant, buildings, collections and objects, to models of museums. We might think of them as verbs, perhaps, museumification or museological practices, activities, rather than things in buildings, a model which is distributed, ubiquitous, it's kind of everywhere, and it's integrated rather than being separated off. Now, I'd like you to expand on that, Ken, and your reactions to that model, Elaine.
Right, well, what comes to mind, and it's only just come to mind, is that years and years ago I went to the Philadelphia Children's Museum. They had just tried at that stage to bring in the Latino audience by putting in wonderful exhibitions, all in Spanish, etc., etc., etc. And it failed terribly. When I was there, they were realizing that what they had to do was to take their offering out to the Latino communities, and what's more, tested against those communities, is this what you actually want? And I think they were waking up to this terrible thought that in fact the central place was failing them. It was in the beautiful old villa downtown, in the best area of town, etc., etc., etc. Now, we have to go out there, not only disperse, but find out what it is that actually people out there want. And this is why I say there's a new career out there in cultural facilitation for all you museologists, and you should be grabbing those opportunities as you can.
Elaine, your thoughts?
Well, I'm realizing you're sitting in Te Papa, and let me talk about Te Papa from an outsider perspective, because you're used to Te Papa, but in fact, Te Papa is a model for the future. Very difficult to sustain, as Arapata will tell you, because half of its power is built in linguistics without evidence. It is about the traditions of the Maori people. It's about the fact that you, in an English-speaking lecture, started with a mihi. And it is, I think, as much about linguistic expectations in your country that are really interesting to outsiders. You believe, as a matter of course, that the major groups of your country should be represented in all activities, whether they're museum or not. People speak Maori, the and you want to go for Kai. This notion that linguistically and even with protocol, you are used to privileging different groups using different models at the same time. And one of the things that I'm looking at now is not only the way HR departments look at what we count as equality, which is not numerical. And I use as an example all the time that if you're Maori and somebody in your iwi dies, what you need as time off is much more time off than if you're a Jew and somebody in your family dies. But if you're a Jew, you need 7 days at this end, but if you're Irish, you need 7 days at that end. We are used to counting those days rather than saying everybody gets to honor their ancestors in ways that are appropriate and therefore everything equals one. The first place in my career, and almost the only place that struggled with how to look at equity using non-materialistic and non-mathematical models, was Te Papa itself. And what constitutes a knowledge person in a iwi, and is that equal to curator, or is that equal to junior curator, was intellectual pursuits that I have carried the rest of my life. One of the things we are all going to have to look at is how we action actually the disparate ways in which we are culturally committed to our own people. They are not equivalent. And because they are not equivalent, we are going to have to figure out both linguistic and exhibition models and other models that allow simultaneity. And that's a very difficult issue. But I'm really interested, for instance, in complexity as a linguistic way of fixing this. Can we present issues in which people of goodwill have very different opinions and have a way of crossing them without it being an argument? Is there a way in which we train children about what respect constitutes, even if it isn't agreement? So Te Papa is, in the world of museums, still, even though it's an unrealized model, is still the most progressive model of its kind.
A lot of what you're talking about seems to me to be a relational thing, a relational model. People talk about, Christina Krebs, the anthropologist, talks about appropriate museologies. You know, there are many different museologies. There's indigenous museologies, Western museologies, and so on. So in that sense then, a kind of a decentered museum, which is a verb and not a noun, where these different relational models sit side by side, can be perhaps a kind of a template for how society itself might operate. Ken's definition, distributed, ubiquitous, integrated, it's interesting that in 2019, ICOM, the International Council of Museums, tried to come up with a new definition of museum, which led to a lot of debate. The old model tended to be focused sort of inward on collections and public service and exhibitions and so on, and the new model much more kind of diverse and inclusive, but a lot of debate in the museum world about that model. And I've heard Arapata actually sort of say that crises like the ones that we're facing right at the moment with the pandemic are opportunities for institutions to rethink themselves, that there is a lot of bad things happening in terms of money and closure and staff being laid off and so on and so forth, but it's an opportunity to actually rethink the model, to think of these big philosophical things that we're talking about today and not just the kind of technical sort of operational sort of issues. Final thoughts about that, Ken, and we're going to open up for questions.
Yeah, well, my final thought on that is it's the crux of the problem. What I would suggest, though, is we force our thinking, as we rethink in the days of plague that we're in, we force our thinking to the top. I start off my definition with moral-based. How do we define moral? What is a moral nation? What are moral behaviours, etc., etc.? And this, I think, is where Te Papa actually works pretty bloody well. We have decided that as human beings, there is a commonality that we can list as a set of virtues and activities and whatnot, and these are part of what it is to be human. And if we start with those sorts of things, we can define a museum that is not based on everything that's underneath it, all the functions that we come to work every day to do.
Thanks very much. Ken, any final thoughts on that note, Elaine?
I start with a moral beginning as well. I think that's a good way to do it. I would give you one other thought. The models of work come from a hierarchical, privileged time of the Victorian time. It is work itself, the assumptions of work, that need to be reinterrogated.
Thanks, Elaine. We're going to turn now to some questions that are coming through, and I'll be interested in your responses to these questions. So there's a few comments coming through about virtual tours and the digital, and there's been a lot of debate this year as museums have been physically closed and visitors have not been able to see objects and collections, that virtual exhibitions and digital access is the answer to these problems. And I think there has been a lot of debate about this. Some people are real cheerleaders for the digital in this kind of space, as if it's the answer to a lot of these kinds of problems. Other people are very critical about the current state of virtual exhibitions. People talk about the post-digital age that we're living in. The journal I edit, Museum World's Advances in Research, has done a survey on the pandemic, and a lot of the responses coming back to that survey talk about the shortcomings in virtual exhibitions around the world. I'm very happy to pass that on to people. If you want to get in touch with me through Victoria, I'm happy to pass on a lot of those responses to the survey, including from people like Ken, Brett Mason, David Gamester and others in New Zealand and around the world. So what are your thoughts, Elaine and Ken, about virtual tours and digital access? And then I've got a couple of follow-up questions as well.
So my first thought is I don't believe in either or worlds, and the way in which the dialogue is set up, I disagree with. I believe that the virtual has a whole lot of usefulness, and thank God there is virtual during COVID, and I've learned a lot. And I believe that being in each other's company and in the company of objects and other things matter a whole lot, and together they matter a whole lot, and that the whole issue of setting up dichotomies is part of the ways we have to retrain ourselves to stop doing.
Both and rather than either or.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Elaine. Ken?
Yeah, well, digital delivery stands alongside the book and the exhibition, which had to be invented, a couple of hundred years ago. Let's use it well. The important thing is authorship. Making sure we know that it has been authored for the best possible reason, to the best possible purpose, and that is available to us. So that, once again, it's that moral thing. What are we saying? Who has authored it? What level of trust can we put in it? All those sorts of things.
Have either of you got any thoughts about the visitor experience post-visit? So if someone does come to a museum or gallery, in what ways can museums and galleries enrich the post-visit experience?
Well, I'll start off because I can remember Bill Tramposh talking to this years and years ago. They actually tested people leaving Colonial Williamsburg 6 months later. What were those people thinking about that visit? And the big one that was in most people's minds was, did I take a good, or did I go to the library and pick up a good book? That sort of follow-up. Knowing what people are taking away, the big questions in their mind, and having that material that is beyond the exhibit, the physical piece of plant itself.
There's two bits of research I can think of here at Te Papa, actually. One by Lynn Allen about post-visit thoughts about the Blood Earth Fire exhibition on level 3, and another by Philip Seuch, who some of you may remember, who used to work here at Te Papa, now Professor of Museum Anthropology in Munich. And he did interviews with visitors to Te Papa and analysed their thoughts about the bicultural experience, or their views of what it was like to do a tour or see Māori exhibits in relation to settler Indigenous relations in their own country. So visitors from Canada, Australia and the USA. And he interviewed them 6 months after their visit to Te Papa, as well as just coming out the door. Very, very interesting. And I think there is a lot more work to do in that area of what the long-term impact on people's lives, thoughts, well-being is after the museum visit. That's the questions coming through from Slido. We've got a few more minutes left, and it's a fairly intimate setting here in Soundings Theatre now. I don't know whether we have any mics, but if there are any questions out there in the audience from people with big, loud voices, you might like to pose a question for Ken or Elaine before I put some of my students on the spot and make them ask a question. He pātai. Robin, up the back.
Kia ora, Robin Hogan from Victoria University, not a student, but a lecturer, I suppose. Interested in exploring further cultural facilitation. What would you see people doing, and how might we train people for that role?
Cultural facilitation in museums, and what is it and how might we train people for that role? And I guess both of you have talked a little bit about that in terms of this emphasis on activities, things happening in communities, bottom up, sort of aggregated out beyond buildings, beyond the walls, le musée imaginaire, that kind of sort of idea.
I see it all the time out there with local authorities who are employing people to actually get out there and talk to the community and do things with the community and influence town planning, influence policy work. It's a whole booming area, and it's so very pleasing to see it in small towns in Australia and New Zealand who are actually making sure that their little cities, places like Wagga Wagga and whatnot, are that much more exciting because there are people within the city administration who are bent on doing it and actually talking to the people in your street.
It was really interesting. I think, Robin, we've talked about this with Awhina Tamarapa, of course, Te Auaho Newstrom in Foxton, and the way that whole project with the Dutch community, Ngāti Raukawa and Horowhenua District Council was part of the Community Services Division of the Regional Council. So it's seen as being, I guess, one of those civic apparatus, a technology that the council can use along with footpaths and swimming pools, paid for by rates, which can help with community cohesion, well-being, identity, And of course, we're very much in the wellbeing space, aren't we, in terms of policy and funding post-COVID. Thanks, Robin. Elaine, any thoughts there before we go to another question?
I think it has also to do with etiquette. One of the things that I'm struck in the little village, I live in a tiny island. It has 9,000 people, but two very separate cultures. We don't often enough tell each other things like what family values mean to us, and therefore we will not do work in certain ways. Let me give you an example. People in my island leave work at 3 o'clock, not because they're lazy, which is what the colonists thought, but because they pick up their children who they do not allow to wander about by themselves. And I had a long conversation with a Western hotel chain about ways we could have a rota in which we recognized that people were picking up their children. And it was as if I was talking in a foreign language. But that was just completely an unacceptable thing. If people wanted to work, they should work, was his response. So there is whole notions of how we greet each other, what language means, what space between we begin means, what a me, he means before you begin, that we need to begin to sensitize ourselves about. So what Ken is talking about, people speaking to each other, assumes that people speak to each other, but my experience is that they don't, and that the method of speaking to each other is by itself a coded and cultural method. The way in which, how long before you begin to speak on the subject at hand is culturally coded as well. It behooves us to start to learn that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Elaine. There's a question up here.
Yes, the issue of what you do out there in the community to make it a more educational experience brought me back to a talk I recently heard by Jock Phillips, of course, whose primary interest is monuments in terms of his own recent work. And the proposal to put scannable codes on monuments, buildings and such like is something that's obviously indicated but is going to work far better post-COVID, because not just the younger generations who are into this world already are going to be joined by people from perhaps my generation who never thought we would get into scannable codes and using our smartphones, and we've had to upgrade them in many cases so that we have the capacity. And it seems to me the potential there is quite significant, and I can see ways of integrating that with some of the other things you were talking about. And I just wonder whether you have, Ken in particular, any thoughts about how that can be taken further.
That's a great question, and I hope you all scanned the QR code when you came in today. We're using those a lot more these days, aren't we? So a question about Jock Phillips, who was a former chief historian, of course, professor of history at Victoria, the concept leader for the history exhibitions at Te Papa, who recently wrote his memoirs as well, History Man, and he was a great advocate of war memorials around the country and the preservation of those. So the question really is about this heritage, objects and collections which are outside the walls of the museum. If the museum does become dispersed beyond the physical bricks and mortar, how do we interpret that stuff? And perhaps it's through these digital platforms like QR codes. Ken, your thoughts? Elaine, your thoughts? QR codes, mobile apps? How do we do interpretation out in the field?
So I'm struck, this might not sound like the answer, but I'm struck with my 7 grandchildren locked in their houses with their phones, all of them learning very obscure things. They'll tell you that they're wasting time, but when I ask them what they're learning, they're becoming experts on very weird things. I really do believe the research capacity of the QR code and the phone and everything has opened a whole world of browsing function in which we have highly educated but bizarrely educated people everywhere who know weird stuff, but know it thoroughly. I'm for as much of the browsing function through whatever means we can, everywhere we can do it.
Thanks, Elaine. Ken?
An excellent question. Once again, this whole idea of authorship, and I think Elaine is alluding here to the breadth of information that is available to us when we do scan our code. It shouldn't be a single author. In fact, there should be an action. We should be going down to Courtney Place, and as far as I'm concerned, the plinth can remain. I like the plinth, but Queen Victoria should be brought down to eye level and put down there. So that action is your marketable event. And that causes people to go and visit Queen Victoria at eye level and then scan the code. And the code introduces you to a whole lot of possibilities, browsing possibilities. The kids are so much better at it than us.
I can see Michael Upchurch in the audience, who has a profound question on the tip of his tongue about digital labels.
Yeah, when you see the sort of the advantages that digital labels bring in museum space to open up content to more people, accessibility, what are those sort of more recent interesting developments you've seen in that space?
So Elaine, that question was about digital labels in exhibition spaces, which enable content to be updated, interpretation from visitors or whatever. What's the potential for that kind of technology? Ken?
Well, I have problems with labels as overload. And this to me is a problem. To me, an exhibition is a three-dimensional environment that shifts our emotions. And if it shifts our emotions one little bit and causes us to think afresh, it's achieved. The whole idea that it has to be overlaid with information upon information, we just get information overload. The worst possible exhibition is where you go in there, and Susan and I saw a wonderful Andy Warhol exhibition. It was wallpapered with stuff, and people were just turning away in droves. The objects themselves were brilliant. It was defeated by its interpretation. So our skill is to make sure that whatever we do, we don't defeat that emotional transposition that, to me, is the outcome of a great exhibition.
Elaine, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's the first time tonight that Ken and I are in juxtaposition. I agree with Ken that we don't want visual overload. But in today's world, in which hidden data dots and endless ways of you carrying the data in your own phone does not interfere with the object itself, I am for what Ian Whitty said, which I quote all the time. I want to go to a museum about war to learn about bicycles.
To learn
It's
about
my favorite line about to learn about bicycles. This notion that you look at something and it triggers a memory, it triggers an interest, it triggers a question, and that you have access to the answer, which you now do on your phone, without it interfering with Ken's exhibition. I agree with him, it's not on the exhibition. But the more stuff I can get in case this is the one that one of my grandchildren is interested in, the better. And the way in which that's now available, because it's not necessary to imprint it in any of the exhibitions, the better it is for people to start to understand whatever it is interests them is good. To be able to tell my grandkids that what they're doing is in fact studying, and what they're doing is in fact becoming expert, is a great pleasure to me, even though what they're learning about has nothing to do with our canon of expertise.
In that sense, the technology has affected education and learning in the same way as it has cultural institutions, because it's distributed and networked and decentered, and there's no longer that kind of, sole authoritative sort of source of information.
Except
that
museums, to me, are theatre. When I go and visit the Watts Towers, which I've done 3 times, and it's quite an expedition, by the way, you are gripped by the theatre of the situation, not by necessarily the information. The information comes later. I buy the massive great tome, was it Fire in the Night? The history of the 60s in Los Angeles. And I read that later. But I am fired up by that sense of theatre that is important. I go to Geelong and I wander along Jan Mitchell's things. I take on board what she's saying, but it's later on probably that I access all this information. It's the theatre that's important to me. I'm an experienced developer, I'm sorry. I look at that whole idea of, did I grab so many eyeballs because I did this, this, and this, and this? Doesn't matter whether it's in a building or outside. Did I actually engage people and cause them to think again, cause them to shift their emotions?
Experiential. Thanks, Ken. Any last questions out there? Because our time is just about up and we probably should wrap up fairly soon. He pātai anō ai.
I do not stand to raise a question, but to acknowledge the wisdom, the evidence, and the great love for a possible future for our beloved land of Aotearoa. Elaine, kei toku kuia tēnā koe. Tēnā koe I te mōhio whānui, I te hōhonu o tō kite. Tēnā koe me ngā tikara. I takoto mai nei a koe I roto I te hālo tēnei a. Elaine, I thank you for your wisdom, the evidence which you have presented. Rungamaraeroa being a possible plan, strategy, and the healing of our nation, post-COVID. I wish to acknowledge the words of wisdom left by my elders. I stand in acknowledgement and affirmation of what the evidence you have presented aligns with the words of wisdom of my people. I am Rānea. I am the Māori writer here at Te Papa. I am responsible for the 50-50 bicultural text at Te Papa through exhibitions. I stand here beside with my sister Victoria. We carry the role of 50-50. And that love of the post-COVID, the great teaching of our nation, and to be kind, to love, to wakaeke noa, my sister acknowledge. I acknowledge simply but the truth and the evidence what you have presented, my elders. Speaking of our manaroa and the hope and the promise for a great future and the healing of our nation through the Treaty of Waitangi and the Holy Bible. This cannot be contested, these are the footsteps of our nation. I leave it up to these words to just simply acknowledge my kaumātua, my elders, that I seek together a true vaccine to address not only the coronavirus, but the colonisation corona and the origin of its name. And we know the footsteps and how they came into my beloved land. Tēnā koutou arapata, kōti, tēnā tātou, my friends, my co-workers, kāti punei. Rangi ua tēnā rangi haue a rangi toko na rangi whae o tuko tu tumu wahine. Te awhakāpu te te rangi āwhanga ko te teriki, te tauina no rangi no rongo. Ka puta ki te whai kāo ki tāo mā. Tūru o ki whakamaua kia tēnā.
Kia ora Rānea for those words. And that seems like a very good place to finish today. Rānea talking about Rongomarairoa as a model for healing, he waka eke noa. So at this point, hoi anō, Ka mutu koe nā tātou kōrero mō tēnei wā. Kanunga mihi kia koutou, e hara mai nei, e whakarongo mai nei, e tipurangi, me ngā kai kōrero tokurua no hoki, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou. Thanks to everyone for coming along today, for listening in. Thanks to National Services Te Paerangi and Arapata for hosting us, and to Elaine in Puerto Rico and Ken here in Wellington. Thank you very much for your thoughts about museums post-COVID. Kia ora tātou.